Great. Looks like we are at noon. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us over the lunch hour. My name is Julie Fitzpatrick. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Downtown Center, and I'm thrilled to bring this webinar to all of you in partnership with Preservation Pennsylvania. So before we kick things off, I do want to just thank everybody who's been involved in this process from the very beginning. Certainly both Mindy and Sabra from the Preservation Pennsylvania, and they're a wonderful nonprofit. If you aren't familiar with Preservation Pennsylvania, I would encourage you to check out their website. They're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year, which is pretty exciting. And then also my partner in crime, Emily Zabel from Pennsylvania Downtown Center. And we are actually celebrating our 35th anniversary with the Pennsylvania Downtown Center here, as a statewide nonprofit. And we'll be also celebrating at our conference in June. So just a quick plug, registration is open for that, but we would encourage and invite everyone to participate in our conference here in Harrisburg at the end of June. So thank you also to our presenters. We have an all-star lineup for sure. I want to say, thank you to Silas, to Larry, to Emily and Melinda. This is a great opportunity to bring this conversation to Pennsylvania. We hope that you will walk away from today's presentation really with a sense of being informed in what the American Rescue Plan Act can offer for your community, for your nonprofit organization. And we also hope that you will be inspired to act, because I think this is the toughest part, is really to kind of make that ask and have the confidence and the information to be informed, to really make that ask either with your local municipality or with your county itself. So with that being said, it looks like we have a good number of our folks who have already joined us and are connecting right now. And I think I'm gonna shortly pass this over to Silas. One more housekeeping item just to mention is we will be monitoring for questions throughout the presentation, and we're just asking you to use the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat, and we will keep an eye on that throughout today's presentation. So if you can, please use the Q&A feature. All right, well, Silas, I see that you're all ready to go, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Julie, and thanks everyone for being on. I'm going to give very broad brush overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, particularly as it relates to funding for counties and municipalities, which I think, as you'll hear today, is one of your most likely ways to be able to access some of the historic funding that's now available in Pennsylvania. And then a little later on, you're going to hear case studies from specific communities about how they've been accessing the funds and thinking about the funds. And as Julie said, I believe you'll have access to all this, so don't feel like you have to jot all this down. There was a lot of information in here, but you'll be getting a copy of these slides from all the speakers. So just a disclaimer at the beginning and maybe an encouragement. I'm going to talk a lot about how the ARPA funding relates to heritage and revitalization, the kinds of things that we all care about. But if you're with an organization that does conservation work or is more focused on the arts, or other uses that sort of meet the spirit of ARPA, I'd encourage you to take a good look at the final rule that Treasury has put out and some of the other guidance out there, because there are a lot of different ways these funds can be used, and you need to be thinking broadly and creatively about them. The Treasury did publish their final rule on ARPA in January, which really made it possible for communities to really start allocating funds. Before that, there was an interim rule in place that allowed counties and municipalities to move forward. But without a final rule in place, a lot were holding back. That's now been established. And so there aren't many things that are still standing as barriers to this funding being allocated. And of course, and I'm sure my other speakers would share this caveat, that this is based on my interpretation. There is some legal guidance out there, but in reality, the definitive way to find out about this funding is through going to the US Treasury's website, looking at their final rule, their fact sheet. It is a 437-page document, but you can easily search it for different terms, and it's tough to comprehend, but not impossible. So I would encourage you to take a look yourself if you have questions. So In very general terms, ARPA was a very large stimulus package passed back in March 11th, 2021. So it's been with us for over a year now. Nationally, the act provided funding for a lot of different responses to the pandemic, from public health to supporting educational institutions to testing and vaccination, some infrastructure. And in Pennsylvania, the state government, our counties and local governments all received funding. There are several municipalities in Pennsylvania that actually declined federal funding, but as you can imagine, most were very eager to accept the funding, which totals $7.5 billion. 2.8 billion of that is going directly to counties, and then municipalities are receiving $3.3 billion. So this is a very significant amount of funding. It's not a small funding pool. Every county and individual municipality in Pennsylvania will receive funds via the ARPA, Rescue Plan Act, and they are eligible for a variety of things, and we'll talk about that in more detail. There are some nuances here. So county governments and municipalities with more than 50,000 residents received a direct allocation from the federal government. And if you don't know how much your county received, there are good resources online. You can simply type in something like Pennsylvania counties ARPA allocations, find very easily what they've received. And then municipalities that were on the smaller side received their funds passed through from the state, but are still subject to the US Treasury's guidelines. So it's a very similar program where, regardless of the source, your reporting may change, but the use of the funds doesn't dramatically change. As I said, these are very substantial allocations. On a county level, we're talking about tens of millions to more than $100 million in some cases. Even with individual municipalities, it could be multiple millions of dollars down to tens of thousands of dollars. But regardless, it's based on the size of the county and the municipality. And so even for very small municipalities, this is a large windfall of funding. Just to give you some examples of the extremes here, Westmoreland County getting over $100 million, Clinton County getting 7.5, Northampton over in the Lehigh Valley, 61 million. And then you start to look at some of the individual boroughs. So Shamokin Dam, Snyder County, 179K, Mifflinburg, home to the best Oktoberfest in the state, 367K, City of Scranton, 68.7. So you can see the full range down to Railroad Borough here in York County that got $29,000, which even at that is a big addition to their regular budget. So this is something that impacts everyone. And regardless of where you are in Pennsylvania, you do have an opportunity, and your municipality and your county have an opportunity to invest this funding wisely. So in the final rule, and even in the earlier interim rule, there were 4 or 5 major buckets of funding that were sort of like the top line headlines that were getting a lot of attention for how these funds could be used. And they were very obvious things that won't come as a surprise. Supporting public health expenditures, because of course this was a response to a pandemic, addressing negative economic impacts across industries and businesses, but also individual households. And then replacing lost public sector revenue. So this is one that you're going to hear a lot about because many communities are using their ARPA, at least in part, to fund lost revenue from declining tax revenue, other costs that they might have taken on. And the great thing for municipalities and counties is that the portion of their ARPA funding that's taken as lost revenue is almost unrestricted. Like you can use it to fund anything that your county or municipality would have done with those funds had they gotten their regular revenue. So that'll come back into the conversation a little later. The Treasury also said that investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure were allowable uses. And probably many of you in Pennsylvania have heard a lot about the broadband piece of that with trying to close the digital divide in our underserved communities. And then the final piece was supporting safe reopening of businesses in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industries. And it's notable that Treasury called this out specifically because these 3 sectors were among the hardest hit initially and continue to have the longest lag time in terms of recovery. But very importantly, and this will be my refrain that I keep going back to throughout the presentation, in the guidance, in the final rule, it says that recipients, meaning municipalities and counties, have broad flexibility to identify and respond to other pandemic impacts and serve other populations that experience pandemic impacts beyond those that are listed in the final rule. The reason that's important to folks on this call is that the word historic shows up in the final rule 18 times. None of them are really related to heritage. The words heritage, cultural, Main Street, bids, CBD, they don't show up in the final rule. Revitalization is mentioned several times, but only in passing. And so if you were to take a very quick look at the final rule and you were going to take the most conservative interpretation of the final rule, you might say, okay, Treasury doesn't specifically say I can use this on historic preservation or to fund a heritage organization or on downtown or Main Street uses. And that is clearly not how Treasury intended their final rule to be applied. They make it very clear in their guidelines that they are not including an exclusive list. And then even in their FAQs, they talk extensively about how there are other uses for these funds. And in large part, they can be determined by counties and municipalities based on what their local priorities and needs are. The Treasury also indicated that the same types of uses that were eligible under the CARES Act, which was the big stimulus and pandemic recovery program in 2020, are also eligible under ARPA. And many counties and municipalities did make CARES fund investments in uses that are related to Main Streets, downtown organizations, historic preservation. And so they set a great precedent there of using federal funds. To date, nobody's sort of been flagged for the use of those funds, saying that was inappropriate. And now we are with this other source of funding that said anything you used CARES for is also eligible under ARPA. So there's a great precedent. So what does this all mean, given that all these uses aren't explicitly called out? If you're thinking of how you rationalize the use of ARPA in your community, it's important to think of the impact that heritage and revitalization have and how they apply to things that are funded by ARPA. So one of the major uses of ARPA funding is economic response and response to the impact of businesses and the organizations that support businesses. And it's important, especially in a state like Pennsylvania that has such a large tourism industry, to point out that heritage tourism in Pennsylvania, and this is an old number, is nearly a $3 billion industry that employs more than 37,000 Pennsylvanians. If you just look at specific regions like the Schuylkill Greenways, between Philadelphia and Pottsville, or the DNL Heritage Corridor between Wilkes-Barre and Bristol, you can see these regions drive significant economic value through attracting tourists that are visiting heritage sites, but also some of the associated natural resources like canals and rivers and streams and parks. US Treasury, as you just saw in the previous slide, specifically identified tourism as a vulnerable sector. So restarting PA's tourism economy is a priority use of ARPA funding. And when you look at the piece that heritage tourism plays in that sector, then it's not a big leap to say that investing in the assets that allow that tourism economy to thrive, such as museums, theaters, performing arts spaces, historic sites, is an important part of stabilizing and expanding that very vulnerable industry that's trying to recover. The same is true when you look at Main Street programs and other downtown programs where there has been significant reinvestment leveraged through those types of programs. In Pennsylvania, Main Streets have leveraged at least $1.7 billion in public and private investment, created over 7,200 businesses, and sustained 24,000 plus jobs. That's really important because a lot of times the organizations that are supporting our downtowns are the ones that are serving as conduit for funding. They're putting together deals, they're supporting businesses, helping them navigate disruptions like COVID. And it's important to see those Main Street programs, which can be very small in some communities, still having a very significant impact on a macro level. And of course, and this is preaching to the choir, that historic preservation is economic development. And although many economic development professionals don't see it that way, I'm sure many of us who work in downtowns or along Main Streets know how important the preservation of landmark buildings are, neighborhood stabilization. and the importance of preserved historic places as the platforms for the tourism that we're trying to drive into Pennsylvania's communities and their regions. So it's not a stretch at all to say that heritage and revitalization are key components of economic growth in Pennsylvania, and therefore would be, a priority use within ARPA. But it also goes more broadly than those specific figures around the impact of the activities. Investing in historic walkable downtowns are also crucial pieces of what's become the most competitive part of economic development in Pennsylvania, which is talent and business attraction. This is a field that used to be dominated by putting on lavish shows for corporate executives as they come into a community, talking about how low you can bring their taxes down, how much you can incentivize their investment in the community. And really what the conversation about talent and business attraction in Pennsylvania has become is more about quality of place. And the fact that when a business comes to your community, they'll have to attract and retain talent to make their business thrive. And the kinds of things that recent college graduates are looking for, but really across the spectrum, people are looking for is place over career. That's why places like Boulder, Colorado, they don't have better jobs. They have a better place where they fully leverage their place and have now drawn the talent to it. And Pennsylvania has that same opportunity. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of that, and we can build on that. And this is not just sort of, a feel-good thing. So corporate executives, I think it was the NRPA did a survey of corporate executives nationally who said that quality of life, like historic walkable communities, rank on par with things like energy costs, transportation, market access, all the things that site selectors used to put above everything else. Now they're putting quality of life right there. So we are very well positioned to say that the kinds of things we care about are squarely within the realm of economic development and part of our economic recovery. You also saw that, or you would see throughout the final rule, that the Treasury Department talks a lot about trying to make sure that ARPA funding goes to areas and populations that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. And that is certainly true of our main streets, our central business districts, particularly in small cities. And not only was that true of the front end of the pandemic, the initial impact, but also in the recovery. That's where we see, the return of businesses lagging. In 2021, we saw a record year for new business starts. So more people than ever deciding to start businesses. But a lot of that growth occurred in larger metros, not in micro metros, where we actually saw overall net businesses shrink. So that's just another indicator that there continues to be a need to support our central business districts and our main streets, despite what feels like a pretty robust recovery. And of course, those of us who are in downtowns or communities that rely a lot on office space, that there was significant vacancy, that nationally that continues to be a very high level. And in communities where we see a lot of leisure and hospitality, restaurants, bars, we continue to see significant job loss, despite coming back very robustly. Still lags by nearly 20% the employment levels before COVID. So all that is to say, we can sometimes take off our hats as people who care about these communities, where we're always trying to boost them and make them sound great, that there are some lingering structural issues that COVID started and that probably inflation will continue, that are necessitating ongoing investment in these places. And then, of course, many of us work for nonprofits, and we know that nonprofits in the heritage and economic development sector have also been impacted disproportionately compared to employees in other sectors. 44% of museums lost at least 50% of their revenue in 2020 and 21. 10% of museums lost almost all of their revenue in those 2 years due to restrictions on how many people they could have in their facilities. Compared to the nonprofit sector broadly, arts and cultural organizations have suffered 3 times the job loss of average nonprofits, and arts and culture and heritage are among the sectors most at risk of a drawn-out recovery of more than 6 months. So we are very much a vulnerable sector. when we talk about the physical and the mental health benefits of our work, because that's another big pot of eligible funding, it's important to note the role that historic walkable downtowns play in our public health response and recovery. I think many of us experience that having access to walkable communities, trails, parks, open space became very critical during the COVID pandemic. And those with access to a good built environment were least likely to suffer disproportionately, because even regularly walking for commuting or to businesses can cut your health risk very significantly. And the places that have better connected walkability and mobility see better health indicators, and that helps them be more resilient when there are public health crises like COVID. Obviously, very significant mental health implications for those that had access to the same amenities. And even the CDC has recognized that access to a built environment that is historic, that's walkable, has great implications for mental health. Within the final rule itself, the Treasury also recognizes this. They say that health impacts of the pandemic are broader than just COVID-19 itself and include substantial impacts on mental health and public safety, and that correlates with the neighborhood's built environment and futures. And they go on to say elsewhere that investing in developing neighborhood features that promote improved health and safety is an eligible expense. And that's important because many of our organizations, business improvement districts in particular, but also main streets, focus significantly on keeping clean, safe, and green environments in our communities. And right in the final rule and in the CDC guidance as well, that correlation is made directly. The final justification that I would point out is also on the equity front. So throughout the final rule, there's a lot of talk about trying to make sure ARPA gets to vulnerable populations and historically disadvantaged communities. If we allocate these funds well, there's lots of opportunities to do this. Most, if not all, main streets and business improvement districts were created to catalyze investment in places that have been underserved. And just to show a few examples on the right, are communities where you're looking at a downtown, but you're mapping it against areas of persistent poverty. And so many of our communities where we've invested a lot in terms of historic preservation and urban revitalization are those communities that experience persistent poverty and have been historically disadvantaged, but also disadvantaged during the pandemic. So it makes good sense to continue investing in the same way as part of our response. The really important thing to remember here that goes back to local autonomy over how funds are spent is US Treasury's guidance. And it's worth going into detail on this for just a second, because they say that recipients can identify other populations or groups beyond those presumed eligible. So there's a lot of talk, not to get into the weeds, of qualified census tracts and trying to know what that is, and if you are one, and what you're allowed to do if you are one and if you're not. But beyond all that, they're saying that if you locally identify a group or an area that's been disproportionately impacted based on local research, academic research, government research, or analysis of your own data or other existing data sources, or, and it's just like, keeps going on, or quantitative data like surveying residents or other approaches to talking to stakeholders, you can determine locally that you want to invest in a certain area, regardless of if it's in the final rule or not. So that means if you decide locally that your downtown has gone through significant COVID impact and the people living there have also suffered disproportionately, you can create a grant program dedicated just to solving that problem. You can invest in properties that help catalyze the recovery of that area because you've identified it as disproportionately impacted and historically disadvantaged, and you have that discretion. And Treasury spells that out. And I would just say that this is also a good time for some introspection on our parts to make sure that our recovery from the pandemic and the way that we do historic preservation, the way that we do Main Street and business improvement district development is in keeping with some of these equity principles that do try to maximize the amount of capital and support that goes to historically disadvantaged populations and communities. So that's the justification at a high level. What can you actually do with the funding? And this is a non-exclusive list, but you can do capital projects with this funding or rehabilitate existing facilities, as long as you see them as part of your community strategy aimed at restarting or catalyzing your economy or heritage tourism. You can make physical alterations of facilities to accommodate social distancing, new approaches to programming you've had to take on during the pandemic, or prepare for future disruptions. You may fund operational or programmatic funding, reduced or eliminated due to the pandemic. So if you are a municipality that provides funding to, for example, your HARB or historic preservation consultant that helps your community and you had to cut that support because of lost revenue, you can take that ARPA funding and put it back into fully funding that. If you have a summer arts program that exposes children to public history, you can fully fund that with this funding. As you saw before, infrastructure projects such as stormwater improvements, water quality projects, broadband expansion, or programming that helps to advance those projects like civic engagement or public input processes to help drive them forward and engage the community. And really that's true about public works projects in general that might be funded through ARPA, but need to be seen through the lens of culture, heritage, the arts, the work that we all care about, and funding organizations to do that as part of these more extensive projects. Obviously, there's a lot of organizations starting to take on placemaking and nature-based placemaking projects that also check some of these boxes on stormwater improvements and water quality. The list goes on. There, you could do direct allocations to nonprofit organizations such as the following: Main Streets and Business Improvement Districts. Counties and municipalities can just simply cut a check directly to them to do their work. Heritage, arts, and cultural organizations of any size, from very large to very small, libraries, museums, archives, music and performing arts venues, your local and regional heritage organizations, arts and culture commissions, heritage tourism organizations, including national and state heritage areas and historic sites. If you have a conservation landscape designated by DCNR in your region, all these are organizations that are working under the justifications that I just outlined for you that all feed back into the goals of ARPA. You can also create competitive grant programs for nonprofits and businesses, and then allow organizations to apply to them, but apply your own prioritization of those programs to say, look, we're gonna open this up to every nonprofit, but those that serve this certain geography are elevated within that. Or if you're prioritizing preservation, you could say, okay, well, we're gonna fund X, we're gonna fund 25% of our grants to organizations that are active in that space. Counties and municipalities have all the discretion in the world to make those prioritizations within their grant programs. You can provide additional funding to your TPAs, your DMOs, your CVBs that are already doing this kind of work, but county commissioners, supervisors can say, within that, we want to see X number go to these geographies, these types of organizations, heritage tourism, and apply some of that specificity so that they don't just sort of get scattered to the wind. They can be directed to some of these priority areas. If you are looking at allocating significant funding to a capital project, there are some specific rules around it that you'll want to take a look at with your solicitor. In general, allocations under $1 million do not require written justification, but if you're ever asked by Treasury, you'll have to say, okay, we spent $1 million on this theater. This is how we see it revitalizing our downtown. This is why it's important. And then if it's over $1 million, you need to provide that written justification. But all this goes back to being able to document what you're doing as it relates to your local needs and the needs of your municipality, your county. And then, of course, all the funding that you pass along to other organizations or that you receive yourself is all still subject to ARPA. It doesn't become unrestricted just because it's passed through to somebody else. So I'm getting towards the end of mine, but I wanted to give you a real world example here in York County. Our county commissioners created a YOCO Strong Recovery Task Force that we use to provide advice on CARES Act allocations and ARPA allocations. And for both rounds of funding, we made significant allocations to organizations and projects within this space. We allocated about $1 million to a variety of organizations, ranging from $200,000 to our large historic performing arts venue, to $5,000 to a very small local arts and heritage group, and pretty much everything in between. We made allocations directly to our county's 2 Main Street programs of $50,000 each. We gave $100,000 to our national heritage area. All of this was for operational funding, you know, to knowing that their revenue was down, that they were doing important work, and that they needed support. That was all in 2020. When we had the opportunity under ARPA to do additional funding, we allocated just under $2 million to very similar organizations, once again funding our heritage area, our Main Street programs, but also making significant capital investment. We invested $1 million into York County History Center's new facility, which you can see pictured there. That's a former MedEd steam plant property that'll become a centerpiece for heritage tourism in our county. And we also put CARES Act and ARPA funding over the course of 3 rounds, I think, into $30 million in competitive grants that went to nearly 2,000 businesses and nonprofits. But as I was just saying, within that, prioritized getting funds to historically disadvantaged businesses, but also those located in low to moderate income census tracts and areas of persistent poverty, which meant that a lot of our funding through that prioritization was driven back into our central business districts and our urban areas, including York City, which collectively received $6.4 million to businesses and nonprofits, and Hanover, which has one of the best Main Street programs in the state, $3.3 million going to Hanover area as well. And I just want to add, and it's a totally different presentation, but we also funded trail construction and development and acquisition of parkland, which is also all eligible under ARPA. So if you're really interested in that, you can email me. So very quickly, the timeline on this: every municipality has already started receiving funds as of June 2021. They must be obligated by the recipient government, which means they have to be determined publicly how they're going to be allocated by December 31st, 2024, and then expended by 2026, the end of 2026. And the costs, I have that worded wrong, but have to be incurred after March 3rd, 2021 to be eligible for this. Counties and cities had to submit a one-time interim report back in August, and have since are on different schedules to do reporting. The important thing to know about reporting is not all the details of it. It's to know that even if your community had to submit a report to the state or to the Treasury Department, that does not mean that they have made all their final decisions on how their funding is being allocated. Many of them have said we are either haven't made any decision yet, and that's their report, or they're saying we're going to do some for tourism recovery, we're going to do some for revenue replacement, but haven't made the specific decisions underneath those broad categories of how the money is going to be spent. So even if you hear that your community has submitted a report, you should still reach out and figure out what that really means. Finally, what should you do right now? You should definitely reach out to your county or municipal leadership now. You want to be able to understand their process because it's different for every county and every municipality. Some have online portals to apply. Some are just taking letters. Some have task force. Some haven't done a single thing. So you want to reach out and you want to understand from your county commissioners, county administrator, your township supervisors, your borough council, how are they handling their process? And then you want to enter that process as quickly as you possibly can before they make those decisions about allocation. I'd recommend you make that a very formal ask, not just an email, not just a conversation, but get your request in writing and submit it. And then start to make your case through all the ways that you traditionally advocate for funding, your board members, your local elected officials, and make them know how important your work is to the community. And then finally, to not take no as the first answer, because reflexively, many communities are worried about the use of these funds. They're looking at that massive final rule and they're saying, we want to use these in the safest way possible. So right off the bat, people are going to be like, well, I don't think you can fund that. I heard you could only fund water infrastructure and public health stuff. That is not the case. And I hope that you've seen throughout this that the final rule gives broad discretion for municipalities and counties to think creatively about the use of these funds and put them to their highest and best use. So don't take no as your first answer. It might be the final answer you get, but you fight the good fight and try to make your strongest case. And I will just finish by saying, if you have creative ways that you are using these funds in your community, I know Julie, Mindy, others continue to collect best practices and case studies from throughout Pennsylvania and the rest of the country, because we want to be able to share those with other communities. So feel free to shoot me an email, or I'm sure any of the panelists an email if you have good ideas about how these funds are being used. So with that, I will wrap up mine, stop sharing, and turn it over to my colleague, Larry Newman.
Thank you so much, Silas, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Newman. I'm from Wilkes-Barre up in Luzerne County. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see that. And what I'm going to focus on is our experience with ARPA here in downtown Wilkes-Barre, and I'm going to be focusing on the elements of ARPA that Silas described as being related to business district recovery and to the recovery of neighborhoods and districts that saw disproportionate negative impacts from the pandemic. So this is an aerial view of downtown Wilkes-Barre. My organization, the Diamond City Partnership, manages both downtown Wilkes-Barre's designated Main Street program and the downtown Wilkes-Barre Business Improvement District. And our relevant local ARPA allocations were to the city of Wilkes-Barre, which is receiving approximately $37 million through ARPA, and to Luzerne County, which is receiving approximately $112 million through the ARPA program. And so the pandemic caused tremendous damage to the downtown Wilkes-Barre economy. We pre-pandemic were averaging around 11,000 downtown employees each weekday in downtown Wilkes-Barre. Today, we are only back to around half of that number. And the graph here shows exactly the scale of the impact as office workers shifted to remote work, and shows how we have sort of bumped along trying to actually get people back into the office, and started to realize that to a certain extent, that is never actually going to happen. And we're not going to go back to February of 2020 again. So that means that we are in recovery mode. The impact of the loss of all of those employees and all of that visitation has been tremendous for our downtown. Just to show some examples, our weekly farmers market in the heart of our downtown, on average in 2019, we were seeing around 1,100 people coming to each farmers market every week. And in 2021, we were averaging around 60% of that. Our 2021 downtown restaurant customer traffic was not even 70% of our pre-pandemic levels. And as a result, we have continued to see multiple business closures at the storefront level. So 15 to date in our retail, restaurant, and service businesses occupying downtown storefronts. So this is exactly the sort of data that Silas was talking about in terms of having to make the case for why allocating ARPA funds to business district recovery is so important. So our downtown recovery strategy really has 5 pillars to it. Our intent is to ensure that our downtown is consistently clean, safe, and attractive. We need to help our existing businesses and venues get through this crisis. We need to continue to focus on improving the product by creating lively and interesting and high quality places. We need to market those places to the people that we wish to attract. In our case, it's creating an environment or an economy that is built less around the needs of office workers and more around serving the downtown residents, the college students, the young professionals, the arts, culture, and dining patrons, and the residents of surrounding neighborhoods that we need to begin figuring out how to serve through our downtown businesses. And then lastly, to plant the seeds for new economic growth. What we are doing is, we are we are then matching that up with our tactical priorities for 2022 through our work plan and looking at how ARPA funds can actually help us to meet our 2022 priorities. And so that goes then to the asks that we are making of our city and county. So now let me talk very quickly about how the city of Wilkes-Barre decided to spend, decided to allocate the initial round of ARPA funds that it received. And our city government talks about this being a 9-point plan. And again, this echoes some of the things that Silas was talking about in York County. So our city decided to allocate $1 million to grants to nonprofit human services agencies doing work within our city. They did that through our United Way. Another roughly $1 million went to grants for new businesses locating within the city. This is something that is run through our local chamber. It's called the Spark program. And this particular allocation is something that is critical to us in downtown because it is something that we are using to actually try to attract businesses back into our business district. We have direct assistance to income qualified resident households. That's another $3.5 million that our city government has allocated. Grants for owner occupied home improvement, closing costs and down payment assistance to home buyers throughout the city. That's being handled directly by our city's Office of Community Development. A wide variety of stormwater, sewer infrastructure, park and recreation projects, some additional programs to benefit residents. And lastly, there at the bottom, business recovery assistance that is being provided through our organization. And I'll talk about that in the next few slides. Just to give an example of one of the things that the city decided to fund through its ARPA allocation was this artificial ice rink that was installed late last winter on our public square that was funded through the city's ARPA allocation, again, as an effort to try and assist with business district recovery, provide additional recreational opportunities, and stimulate customer traffic in our downtown, which had seen so much traffic disappear as a result of the pandemic. So our specific request is really focused on two related areas. We are going to be undertaking a marketing initiative to attract new customers to downtown to offset the loss of downtown workers. And specifically, we are seeking ARPA funds to support what we call our College Ambassador Program. So during the earlier stages of the pandemic, we launched a program where college students from our two downtown schools, King's College and Wilkes University, who had majors in appropriate areas, started providing one-to-one assistance to affected downtown property owners as they tried to figure out how to pivot away from serving the office workers that were coming out of our office buildings at lunchtime and pivoting specifically to serving some of the other customer segments that these businesses needed to be able to reach in order to stay in business. We are looking at a total allocation of $300,000. That's $100,000 a year for 3 years. To Luzerne County, and I'm not going to go through the same detail about what the county has started spending its money on. We are seeking a request, and this is actually pushed back a little because the county, as a result of a wide variety of factors, has been holding off until recently in deciding how it wants to create a process to solicit requests for ARPA funding. There have been some starts and stops to this process. And so now there's a formal pre-application process that's underway. We are actually hoping to expand our existing Downtown Ambassador program through the creation of a new wing of unarmed safety ambassadors that can work directly with our existing clean team, also with some of the social service workers, the police department, and others in our downtown, because the emptiness in our downtown over the last 2 years has led to some additional public behavior challenges, some increased issues with regard to at-risk populations. And the fact is that in Wilkes-Barre, this is tied into the fact that we don't necessarily have all of the facilities that we need and all of the programs that we need to effectively assist our most vulnerable populations in downtown. So this is one piece of that. Obviously, this is a preliminary ask. We have no idea how this is going to go. And given how everything has gone, I have no doubt that it's going to continue to evolve over time. But that's right now where we are positioning our request to county government. And we're also supporting some related ARPA requests. As I said before, we do have some gaps in the existing ecosystem of facilities, social service facilities serving our most at-risk populations. And so one of the things that we are very excited about is working with some of our social service partners to create a permanent facility in our downtown, most likely to serve the homeless and at-risk population that would include everything from a day program to transitional and permanent housing with wraparound services, something that we do not currently offer either for men in the Wilkes-Barre area or for families in the Wilkes-Barre area. The other thing that we are hoping to see is a recapitalization of the countywide COVID business assistance grant program that had initially been capitalized through CARES Act funds earlier in the pandemic. That effort, which is being led by our county's chambers of commerce, has initially been tabled by our Luzerne County government, and we're hoping that they will take that up again through this new process, because for disproportionately impacted businesses such as the ones in downtown Wilkes-Barre, this additional assistance is still desperately needed in certain business sectors. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to stick around for questions, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn things over to, Julie's.
I just have a quick question because I know you do need to jump off soon. It's specifically for you, Larry. What type of uses are eligible through your occupancy grants for the new businesses?
Occupancy, you mean in terms of?
I think it was maybe for the chamber program, maybe?
Sure. So the Spark, what you're referring to, Julie, is what we call the Spark program. So that is specifically designed for businesses that are new to the city of Wilkes-Barre. And there are 3 categories of support. They go from businesses that are brand new, that are at what I would call the incubator stage. And those are businesses where you have to actually work with our local small business development center. And the goal is to actually get you to the point where you can launch your business. That's the lowest category of support. The next category is a brick and mortar business that is new, that has its plans in place, has been vetted by the SBDC. And in that case, the Spark grant will pay all occupancy expenses for up to a year. So that means rent, utilities, parking expense, et cetera. And then the final category is existing businesses that choose to either move to the city of Wilkes-Barre or create a new physical location within the city. And those businesses get the highest level of support, again, though, tied to occupancy expenses for a year. And that program has actually proven to be very successful so far. We've actually had 5 different businesses locate in downtown Wilkes-Barre so far, 2 storefront businesses and 3 office-based businesses that are all taking advantage of the Spark program. And we expect that there will be more to follow.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
Sure, thank you.
All All right. Well, then, with that being said, I'm sorry I interrupted the transition there from Larry
It's
to
okay.
Emily, but Emily Fetchko, if you would like to take it away.
Sure. I think this topic is so fascinating, and Silas and Larry did a really great job. I'm sharing this time with a colleague from ERIE, Melinda, and I really want to give her a good chance to speak, but I do want to touch on a few things. Silas is so right. Do not take no, which may in fact be your first answer, as the absolute answer. At the ERIE Downtown Partnership, we have applied unsuccessfully for ARP funding to fund our Safety and Hospitality Ambassador program. And a lot of that was hinged on the DEI component. Our city has done a really amazing and robust job of focusing on underserved populations and neighborhoods, and they're very serious about that. And while we can make our case that we are in fact including and hiring minorities and working in underserved parts of the community and serving the underserved, the process for those applications is highly competitive. But they have come up with a really amazing strategy, very specifically outlining what they want to fund. That's business assistance, minority business assistance. It's things like refinancing garbage debt. We know that a lot of our small businesses are using personal credit cards, same day as cash pay programs out of just sheer terror to try and keep things going. So that was one of the things that our Economic Vitality Committee actually talked about starting in 2020, was this need to help businesses that are going to find themselves in a load of hurt from garbage debt that they'll never pay off and never be able to come out from underneath. And so the city has responded to that. We put forth a application to do we will put forth an application to do public space improvements and creating new vibrant spaces in downtown to address the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic specifically. We are collaborating with the city, who's just sort of going through a participatory budget process to define what they might allocate towards city parks and public spaces. They're very interested in implementation. And unfortunately, right now, the ERIE Downtown Partnership is in a planning mode, wanting to get to implementation. So we have a few things that we continue to try and advance, even though maybe we've already been told no or are anticipating the no. And then the other thing that we're working on, which is where Melinda comes in such great handiness to us as an organization. She's part of our design committee and our design guidelines task force. We are developing design guidelines for downtown. There's a ton of new development and revitalization happening to the built environment, making sure that that's done really well. And we as an organization can help incentivize that. That's something we're also interested in using ARP funds for, but haven't yet. So with that, I want to introduce Melinda Meyer, who is the chair of the city's new Historic Review Commission, which is amazing for our city. She also is very involved in Preservation ERIE. She works at the county in the planning department and has administered ARP funds for the county and is an amazing wealth of information. So Melinda, take it away.
Okay, if one of my fellow panelists could just nod your head that you can see the excellent, thank you. So thank you, Emily, for the handoff. As Emily mentioned, yes, I do work, actually my day job, I work for the Erie County Department of Planning and Community Development. Specifically, I work with grant writing, but with both the CARES Act funding and the coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds coming to the county, it also just simply made sense that I would help in administering those grants as well. So as Emily mentioned, I also, in addition to this job at the Erie County Department of Planning, I also serve on the Historic Review Commission for the City of Erie. Silas has already covered a lot of this material, but I think it's important to reiterate the potential uses of these funds. This is an opportunity for communities to really be creative with addressing longstanding needs and or shortfalls in funding. American Rescue Plan Act funding can be used to invest in parks and public places. So this very much includes public art. This very much includes interpretive panels. This includes heritage trails. This includes the development of apps that will lead people through your downtown corridors. This can be support for small businesses. And as it's been talked about before, I'm trying to mentally go through what has already been touched on. We've talked a little bit about the disproportionately impacted communities. We've also kind of skimmed through the HUD qualified census tracts, but local governments can use this funding to support small businesses in a lot of different ways. This can also be used to support strong and healthy communities. So building on what Silas said earlier about the quality of life components of our communities, what makes our communities vibrant places to live. And then of course we have this overarching category of aid to tourism, travel, hospitality, which is like this giant catch-all category that heritage tourism and small business support. There are a lot of different activities that fall under this. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time repeating this because I feel like those that have come before me have really done an excellent job of covering these. And this is not an exhaustive use of these funds. So examples specific to Erie County, just to provide a little bit of context for Erie County's circumstances. Erie County received just about 53 million in our allocation. And as most folks know, this allocation is going to be distributed over 2 tranches. So Erie County, our county executive and county council, they made decisions in August of last year for the first 26 million. That first 26 million is on the streets. We were probably one of the first counties to actually approve a budget for that full tranche so early in the summer. So the 26 million that was allocated, there were about 29 projects overall that were funded. And since we're focusing on historic preservation, there is one project in particular that I'm going to highlight just as an example of a type of project that is benefiting from the American Rescue Plan Act funding. So a portion of the county's, again, first allocation of 26 million went directly to the Erie County Redevelopment Authority. The Erie County Redevelopment Authority in total received just over $8 million. A portion of this funding is supporting a shuttered venue grant program. A portion of the funding is supporting loans to a diversity loan program that will serve businesses that are minority and or women owned. It will also support, this funding will also support 2 other development projects and a number of other things. So in total, again, just over 8 million went to the Erie County Redevelopment Authority. Of the 8 million that went to them, about 750,000 is specifically allocated for this project. And this is the redevelopment of the historic Erie Malleable Iron Complex. If you've never been to Erie, our West 12th Street corridor is our historic industrial corridor. So this corridor abuts the railroad tracks, and during the late 1800s and 1900s, early to mid 1900s, this was where Erie's largest industrial complexes were located. So over time, these large buildings, right, that are now over 100 years old, they have seen disinvestment. Several of the businesses that once were located in them have closed. So their uses have started to change. And so we now have this corridor that is historically incredibly important to the fabric and the identity of the community, but at the same time, it has a number of vacant and blighted structures that have been that way for a decade or longer. So one of the complexes that was targeted for redevelopment is this Erie Malleable Iron Complex. It was located, or it was built between 1880 and 1915. At least the majority of its buildings were built between this era. And by the time you get to just after World War I, this is considered one of the most significant complexes doing this type of manufacturing within the country. Erie Malleable Iron, at least what was left of it, closed in this facility in 2001. It has been used for storage for varying businesses. And since 2014, the bulk of the building really has been vacant. And so you can see that this industrial complex that consumes an entire city block or more has been sitting in this historic, well-traveled corridor of the city. And when I say well-traveled, this is actually the road when you leave Erie International Airport and come to the city of Erie. This is one of two main roads that takes you into the city. So everyone coming in through Erie International Airport that is using one of the two main routes into the city is passing this industrial complex that is sitting vacant and has fallen into disrepair. So the Erie County Redevelopment Authority really picked this up as a project to tackle recently. So they acquired the property in 2021 and developed plans for its redevelopment. The timing was just incredible. This is a project that the county developed justification for, even though you can see that we did award them $750,000 for this project. It is under that $1 million mark, but we did develop the justification for this project. You can't see it well, but in the photograph on the left-hand side, there's an athletic complex next to the building. Just behind the complex on the other side of the tracks is historic Little Italy, which is one of our neighborhoods targeted for revitalization. And so in addition to being on a main corridor, well-traveled corridor, it is also next to a high school athletic complex and is next to a historic neighborhood targeted for revitalization. So this funding that goes to the Erie County Redevelopment Authority will be used initially to help prepare the site. And you can see in the photograph to the right that not all of the complex will be saved, but a good portion of it will. Something that we did learn through this project and others is that it has been determined that the use of ARP funding does not necessarily trigger Section 106 review. So this project, however, because there are other funding sources, I'm sure some of you have already looked at the $750,000 and said, that's not even going to touch a tenth of what this project needs, right? We know that. So the $750,000 that the county provided through the ARPA funding is just an initial investment to help prep the site, demolish some of the buildings that are structurally unsound, and address some of the environmental issues that need to be addressed, since this was an industrial site. So the photograph on the right gives you a kind of an artist's rendering of what it could look like once the full redevelopment of the site is finished. And you can see that it is a combination of historic preservation as well as new construction. The intent is really to develop this as kind of a tech and innovation hub for the community. And again, its location is so perfect because historically ERIE's innovation and creative problem solving involved our industries. And with this being our historic industrial corridor, it makes sense that ERIE's next iteration of innovation and creative problem solvers would be housed in this old new complex. So in this, on this page, I did provide the project overview that we're using for our reporting to the US Treasury. And you'll see that I also used the expenditure categories. Again, this would be a deep dive, but for those of you that are doing reporting, all of your projects, well, I suppose unless you're using revenue replacement, but even then, all of your projects will need to be tied ultimately to expenditure categories that have been provided by the US Treasury. This is a project I'm excited to see. It is not going to happen overnight. Know that this investment of the first 750,000 work is starting now. However, the vision that you see on the right is going to take multiple years to achieve. For the second example, we're tapping into the work that the city of ERIE is doing. So whereas the county of ERIE received just under 53 million, 53 million, the city of ERIE is receiving just under 80 million. So the city of ERIE, the project example that we're sharing with you really is tied to the development of their historic preservation program. And I think to explain why this project is significant, we really have to start with where the city's historic preservation program is at this time. So historic preservation is relatively new for the city of ERIE. In 2019, I believe, City Council approved the creation of the Historic Preservation Task Force. This group was created to develop a strategy for the city going forward, how to develop a historic preservation program. And I totally get this. Those of you that are on the eastern side of the state, you'll be like, historic preservation programs, we've had those for decades. Let me tell you something. This side of the state, a little different. In any case, going back to the kind of the evolution of the historic preservation program with the city, 2019 was the Historic Preservation Task Force that had a 2-year life. Out of that, the work of the task force, then zoning ordinance was revised, allowing for the creation of historic overlay districts. The city applied for certified local government designation and developed or created the Historic Review Commission, and then hired its first historic preservation planner. So all of this is happening within 2021 and now early 2022. We have no historic overlay districts created. We have no local historic districts in the city of ERIE at this point. The program is brand new. And so to incentivize neighborhoods to get together and or commercial corridors to get together and apply for this local designation, the city has chosen to set aside $840,000 in ARPA funding to incentivize the creation of these historic overlay districts. So This pool of funding is specifically set aside for property owners within historic overlay districts who can then apply for this funding to make improvements to their properties. This is, again, a way in which the city is attempting to incentivize participation in the new historic preservation program and see residents choosing to create local historic districts. So those are the two examples that I brought for today's presentation. We have many others. As I said, here at the county, we have at least 29 different projects that we've supported with our first allocation, which includes we made direct payments to our 9 largest cultural organizations, which includes both theaters, or I should say theater groups, as well as arts galleries, as well as historic museums. The funding was allocated as a one-time contribution to those organizations to help them kind of bounce back after COVID. So I did provide links. It's been mentioned previously. If you haven't yet, you really do need to go onto the U.S. Treasury's website and look at these documents, specifically the final rule. And if the 400 and some pages is just too much for you, I would recommend perhaps starting with the final rule overview. It is so easy to digest. It's actually the one document that I think is so well written, anyone can read it and understand it. So make sure you get your hands on that final rule overview. And then these other documents are related to municipalities and counties who are having to report back on how they're using their funds. But if there's anything that we here at the county, ERIE County can help with, we're certainly happy to do that. We are responding to a lot of questions from our non-entitlement units here in ERIE County. The county itself, the city of Erie, and Mill Creek Township received direct allocations from the U.S. Treasury, and then 35 plus municipalities were non-entitlement units that received funding from the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Emily and Silas. I think Larry had to jump off. We do have a few questions, and I'm going to ask all 3 of you who are left. We've got some that are kind of specific and some that are kind of general. I'm going to ask the last question, the most recent question that was asked. So how should municipalities navigate their own ARPA funding targeting historic preservation versus what may be offered at this point more generally by their county towards those purposes within their own ARPA funding? And then they say, in other words, particularly as it comes to historical preservation projects, is it increasingly important that cities or counties work collaboratively to maximize the funding potential? So
Melinda represents or wears a couple hats there, maybe between city and county. She could take that one first.
So I think it's incredibly important to have both, really to have everyone represented. When the county first became aware, when Erie County first became aware that this funding was going to be coming out, our county executive actually pulled together representatives from our municipalities within the county, the city of Erie, the city of Corey, as well as representatives from the Port Authority, the airport. Any entity that would be receiving ARP funding were brought to a table to have a conversation about how kind of everyone saw the use of these funds playing out, and really to brainstorm how to leverage these funds for additional funding, right? Because per the final rule, it's really important to ask whether or not the ARP funding can be used as a match source for other federal funding. There are some federal programs that will allow you to use it as a match source, and there are some that will not. But of course, this can also be used as match funding for state programs too. So it's important to think kind of broadly about how you can leverage this one-time investment, right, to bring even more funding into your community. As far as decision making, every municipality is doing it, every county and municipality is doing it differently. What I would, I think one of the recommendations that I would make is to do the legwork needed to understand the current needs in your community. You know, we have been experiencing COVID for 2 years now. It is not, the pandemic is not over, at least the economic impact of the pandemic is not over. And so there are going to be lingering challenges for almost all sectors within the community. And so do the legwork, make the phone calls, talk to people, gather information and or conduct surveys, whatever is needed to pull in accurate data for where your community is at in this point of time. The other thing that we've done here locally is we've pulled out our existing community plans. This is an opportunity to see some of those pie in the sky projects that we all weave into our community plans. This might be the time to actually get those done. And so we're trying to also align the distribution of ARPA funding with our existing community plans. Even though it's important to kind of take the temperature and understand the needs in the community now, we also need to look to those community plans, which so much time and money and effort was spent developing, right? To see how we can align this funding to support those recommendations as well. That was probably lengthy, but Silas, jump in.
That was very well said. And I would just add that, you know, just in doing presentations in a lot of different parts of Pennsylvania recently, there's very few areas where it's working seamlessly between sort of the planning at a municipal level and the planning at the county level and leveraging those and sort of deciding who's going to fund what. So don't feel discouraged if you're in a municipality or a county and you feel like there's that disconnect. That is, you know, it's the nature of Pennsylvania with our municipalities and the number of them. And, you know, in York County, we have 72 municipalities and we've tried to coordinate, but it's hit or miss. So I just wouldn't be discouraged if you're sort of feel like that's not syncing up.
Thank you. I think you've each touched on this, but just to clarify, has the Treasury identified funding sources that cannot be combined with ARPA dollars? And this is specifically, they're also asking about other state dollars and in particular RACP funds.
Well, maybe if Melinda can speak to the federal stuff, I'll take the state stuff because I have firsthand knowledge of this one. On the state side, yes, like this is the perfect opportunity to take federal funding and match it to state programs. RACP is a great one. And we know, like here in York County, we are matching RACP to ARPA for a trail project. In Warren County, there's a municipality that's using ARPA and RACP matched together for a waterfront development project. So that is definitely a great use of the funds. And it's a great way to, you know, provide communities with a source of match that they probably wouldn't have had easy access to before. And the same is true of DCNR, DCD, you know, your state agencies that you're used to taking advantage of at a state level. This is like your golden opportunity to have that match that you might not have had before. At a federal level, I imagine it's more complicated, but I'm less familiar with that.
Yeah, so at a federal level, I think if you have a specific federal funding program or grant opportunity that you wish to pursue, one of the first questions I would ask the program officer is whether or not this program, the program that you're applying to, the ARPA funding you have can be used to match that. I don't have an exhaustive list of federal funding sources that can be used as match, but I can tell you that the one that came up most recently is ARC funding, Appalachian Regional Commission funding. And so I have the email to prove it from ARC that ARC funding can, or ARPA funding can be used to match ARC funding, which is fantastic because ARC funding can be used for broadband, trail development, right? A lot of different economic development projects. And so the fact that ARC funding and ARPA funding can be paired, all for it. Other programs I'm not aware of, I would again advise talking directly to the program officer at whatever federal grant program you intend to apply for.
Thank you. Thank you both of you for offering those examples. We do have a question, and I think it may only be pertaining to a few select representatives here. And I think, Silas, you were in the process of addressing it, but it's regarding the shuttered venue operating grants. If a venue has received that already, does that work against that nonprofit in competing for allocated funds to the county?
So, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Melinda. Okay, I was just going to say, just like everything else that Melinda and I have said, it's going to vary almost totally by municipality to county. There's nothing in the guidelines that says if you receive that source of funding, you can't receive additional ARPA funding. It's quite possible that your county commissioners or your municipality might want to prioritize businesses or nonprofits that did not receive other sources of funding, or at least prioritize them first. So for example, in our grant program, we asked, what other sources of federal and state COVID support have you received? That did not, I mean, I don't think it precluded anybody who said that they did from receiving funds in our program, just the way that things worked out with what we had available. But there is nothing in the guidelines that says you can't. The one thing I would avoid very diligently is double dipping on the same expenses or losses. So obviously, if you're a business or a nonprofit that lost $50,000 and you receive $50,000 through the shuttered venue program, don't then turn around and apply for that same $50,000 in losses or expenses from a county source or a municipal source. So just make sure you actually are asking for what you have expenses or losses or a new project or program that you're undertaking to actually cover.
Yeah, so here in Erie County, the shuttered venue grant program that was funded with the county's ARP funding and distributed to the Erie County Redevelopment Authority to administer that program. Yes, we did prioritize those venues that did not receive a shuttered venue grant from the federal government, from that federal program. So it was the federal program was complicated. And so for many of our smaller venues, it became too complicated for them to apply for that funding, and some just gave up after some time. And so for our local shuttered venue grant program, we prioritized those that had not received funding through the federal source. And then to provide a couple of other just examples of how we're choosing to prioritize and or exclude entities. 2.5 million of Erie County's ARP funding was set aside to create a grant program for our municipal partners. So it's called the Municipal Infrastructure Gap Funding Grant Program. And the reason we created that program was because most of our municipalities are non-entitlement units, and that they received such a small pool of funding that it would be difficult for them to complete broadband, like larger broadband and water and sewer infrastructure projects. So the county is kind of filling the gaps. So municipalities can apply for water sewer infrastructure project or water sewer broadband infrastructure projects. And then we will fill the gaps. So we did exclude the city of Erie. In all fairness, though, they did receive more than the county. So, but we have a couple of programs where we've excluded either the city of Erie or Mill Creek Township as recipients of direct allocations from the U.S. Treasury, because we want to, again, meet the needs of the county as a whole. And that means, in some cases, providing funding that is just accessible to our boroughs and townships.
Thank you. We are quickly approaching the witching hour, and the webinar will be cut off at 1:30. But I do just want to bring up two quick questions that I think you had previously addressed, but just to clarify, does someone mind talking about the two tranches? The question is, if municipalities have already allocated or spent their ARPA funding, are there other ARPA distributions planned for the future? Do you mind just confirming that again?
So every entity receiving funding will receive it in two tranches, right? County, state, county, borough, township, whatever unit of local government, two tranches. One was last summer. The second is this summer. I am not aware of additional legislation that will be approving more COVID relief funding. So from what I know, it's just going to be those two tranches, but everyone was told up front what their total allocation would be. And so everyone should be aware of what their total allocation is and what the amounts they will receive in those two tranches. They were split just 50-50. So 50% last summer, 50% this summer. And some municipalities budgeted for the whole allocation. Others, like Erie County, we budgeted based on each tranche. So
Yeah, that final point is what I was just going to echo, in that you just want to understand, have they allocated both tranches, or they just do 50%? Like in York County, we did our allocations for the entire 87 million that we were receiving all at once, knowing that we wouldn't have 50% of the funding until a year from now. So you just want to understand, does that mean like all the decisions are made, or half the decisions are made, or, you know, it just goes back to having that conversation with your local municipality or county.
Great, thank you for confirming all that. We have one final question, and then we'll hand it off to Mindy and Melinda. If you don't mind just confirming this again, and I think this is a great question from a preservation perspective to end with, but the question is, could you please clarify regarding the section 106? You know, is it the money still subject to that 106 review?
yes, so for those who may not know what section 106 is, this is a section of the National Historic Preservation Act that states essentially, if a project involves a federal agency or federal dollars and historic resources, there needs to be a review by the State Historic Preservation Office where the project is happening, within the state where the project is happening. And so, so the national, I believe this decision was made by the National Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, that because the American Rescue Plan Act funding, specifically the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, because they are coming directly from the US Treasury, as opposed to a federal agency, that these funds do not trigger section 106 review when you're working on historic properties. I think we're fortunate that the one example that I provided, the ERIE Malleable Iron, and now that I think about it, I even forgot to mention ERIE Malleable Iron, that complex is actually eligible for listing on the National Register. And so under normal circumstances, federal funding used on the project would have triggered, required or mandated section 106 review with the State Historic Preservation Office. And so if ARP funding alone had been used for that, it would not have. But again, it's a complex project, lots of different state and federal funding sources, not just ARP. And so there will be a review required for that project. Does that provide, okay, clarification?
I think that's what they were looking for. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Mindy, we'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, panelists, for a great discussion. The fact that we had over 300 people sign up for this, some to watch it later, tells us that this is exactly the kind of programming that we should be offering. It's been great to partner with the Pennsylvania Downtown Center. And as Julie said, we are both celebrating big anniversaries this year, so look for some other things that we might be doing together. If you are not familiar with one or the other of our organizations, go check out our websites, sign up for our e-newsletters. And finally, I'd like to thank our Zoom webinar platform sponsor, Margaret and Bob Wallace. Have a great day. Look for the recording and some follow-up materials to come to you by the end of the week. Thanks, everyone.